When you are looking at plants to work on appetite and obesity, you mentioned a bitter plant. How is bitterness tied to satiety?
Across multiple different types of historical medicine, you see an almost consistent usage of bitterness to suppress appetite, control glucose, and help with weight loss. So you eat your food, immediately goes to the stomach, and there's a hormone which makes you more hungry. Then after the stomach in the small intestine, there's a series of hormones, primarily GLP-1, CCK, and PYY, that all suppress your appetite.
Let's talk about some ways people can naturally boost their GLP-1 that don't involve supplements. What are some things that people could do in their lifestyle, in their diet to help?
So GLP-1's interesting in that if you want glucose control from your GLP-1,
Right.
then that's relatively easy to do with dietary compounds. Right? And the reason for that is because at quite a low level, GLP-1 will help with glucose control. There's a lot of stuff which can probably help. You're looking at improving your gut health, so any sorts of prebiotics and probiotics
Right.
will definitely help.
Dr. Walker, thank you so much for coming all the way from New Zealand to come and see us and talk about GLPs.
It's absolutely my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Really appreciate having someone with your level of knowledge come and explain the science of GLPs to us and kind of the pros and cons. You're a PhD in New Zealand, is that correct?
Yes. So I did my PhD in the University of Auckland, and I now work for the New Zealand government as a researcher at the New Zealand Institute of Plant and Food Research.
Wow.
Yeah, and I mainly do work looking at basically translational medicine, but using plant compounds to sort of treat health effects, so diseases, so improving chronic disease with plant compounds.
That's very forward-thinking of the New Zealand government. And it's actually, it's forward-thinking, but it's also rooted in probably some ancient wisdom there as well, using plant compounds to affect our biology.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, the main piece of work that I've been involved in over the last, 14 years now.
14 years.
Yeah, or maybe a little bit more, is developing a plant-based treatment for appetite that ends up triggering some of your body's natural satiety hormones.
Right.
And the great thing about working with plants is that you have a long history of traditional usages. So I was sort of, I guess, in a situation in 2009 where the New Zealand government came along and said, we want to have a plant-based treatment for health and targeting obesity and weight loss. And they really did that because we didn't have any good treatments available. There were the medications that had been available had been withdrawn from the market due to safety concerns. And so they put forward a big, I guess, research opportunity. And they said, have you got any ideas about how you can use plants to regulate appetite and help people lose weight? So the institute that I was working for, Plant and Food Research, put in a $20 million 6-year government grant application, so a large amount of money, to basically see if we could find a bitter plant compound that we could use to suppress appetite.
Right. Yeah, no, that's incredible. And so when you are looking at plants to work on appetite and obesity, you mentioned a bitter plant. How is bitterness tied to satiety?
Yeah, so it's a really great story that actually, because if you look at historical usages of bitterness across multiple different types of historical medicine, you see an almost consistent usage of bitterness to suppress appetite, control glucose, and help with weight loss.
Throughout history, right?
Yep, throughout history, yeah. So in the Highlands of Scotland, they'd use a bitter heath pea to suppress appetite during times of famine. In the Kalahari, there's a tribe which uses a bitter cactus to suppress appetite when they're going on hunting trips. And there's also Vedic and Chinese medicine will use bitterness for glucose control and even treatments for obesity.
Right.
So there's this sort of really long history of using bitterness to regulate appetite. There is one hiccup with that, though, and that's the Romans. And because the Romans used bitterness to stimulate appetite.
They did?
They did, yeah. So they made a bitter-infused wine that they drink immediately before a feast in order to get the sort of the gastric juices flowing so they could eat more food. And so we sort of had this idea. It was like, well, bitterness looks like it's really good for suppression of appetite, but there's that one hiccup with the Romans.
Right.
And so what we decided to do was we thought, well, if it was bitterness on your tongue, then it would go the same way. it would always be suppression. But because it's going up and it's going down, maybe it's bitterness being detected in your gut, in your gastrointestinal tract. And so we looked at how they were used, and we saw that the Romans would take the bitterness immediately before a meal, like right before, but everyone else took it for long-term appetite suppression.
Okay.
And so we looked at the gut, and we saw all of these hormones there. And in your stomach, there's so you eat your food, immediately goes to the stomach,
Right.
and there's a hormone which makes you more hungry.
Right.
Then after the stomach, in the small intestine, there's a series of hormones, primarily GLP-1, CCK, and PYY,
Right.
that all suppress your appetite.
Right.
So we came up with an idea that it was probably bitterness getting to your gut that was suppressing the appetite, and that's what everyone was doing, apart from the Romans, who were taking it short term, getting it to the stomach and increasing their appetite.
Got it.
Yeah, so we started with that theory, and we called it the bitter brake on appetite.
Ah, interesting. Okay, so bitterness in the stomach actually can stimulate appetite. However, if the bitterness gets to your gut, it actually reduces your appetite.
Yeah, absolutely, and that was the sort of the idea we formed, and we undertook what started out as a 6-year research program to pretty much prove it, and we started with a biopsy study in hospital.
Right.
So we really wanted to prove that you could taste bitterness through your gut. And so I ended up going into hospital, approaching people who were having either a colonoscopy or a gastroscopy, and asking them to volunteer parts of their intestine, little intestinal biopsies, so I could look for these bitter taste receptors or bitter taste buds. Took 2 years because almost everyone said no. But we ended up with 28 people who gave samples, and we could show that you had bitter taste systems all the way down your gut. Yeah.
So there's taste receptors going all the way through your gut, starting in your stomach into your intestines.
Yep, absolutely, all the way through. There's even actually smell receptors as well, which is kind of interesting. Yeah.
That is very interesting.
Yeah.
So are this just bitter taste receptors or all of the taste receptors, sweet
You've definitely got sweet. You've probably got sour as well. But it's less clear where the sour is localized. So bitterness is all the way through your gut. Sweetness is certainly in your small intestine, and sour taste receptors are in your stomach, and they may be other places. But what's really, I guess, powerful about bitterness is that because it's everywhere, you can have a really broad effect on your gut signaling.
Right. Yeah. So what do you think evolutionarily is the reason why we have taste receptors throughout our gut?
Yeah. So it's really, I think, to try stop you eating food that you shouldn't. Right? So if you think of bitter taste on your tongue, it's a marker of a sort of a potential toxin. Right?
Makes sense.
So you have it, then you want to spit that out. Now, if you get that bitterness to your small intestine where it's actually being absorbed by your body, your gut's going to have to stop you eating. And so it sends a signal to your brain saying, hey, you better not eat anymore in case it's not so good for you. Now, the good thing about the system is it's way highly protective, which means there's lots of bitterness, which is not toxic at all, that you can use to trigger the system. Yeah. And it's also a very fundamental system. So it's present in all sorts of animals. So it's not just humans that do it, but rodents will do it as well. If you look at cows, if you increase the bitterness in their feed, they lower the amount of food they eat. So it's a well-conserved, what you call mechanism for appetite regulation.
So interesting. So it's not just appetite regulation, it's also protecting you from potentially toxic compounds, toxic foods. So evolutionarily, we can look at it as almost two sides of the same coin, just basically turning off your appetite when you sense bitterness in your gut.
Absolutely.
So it's very interesting. So going back to just obesity, so it seems like the New Zealand government also has this mandate to find something to help the obesity epidemic that's occurring. How big of a problem is obesity in New Zealand? And what are some of the reasons around why people are getting more? I assume there's more of a prevalence of obesity. What are some of the reasons behind that?
Yeah. So we sit roughly the same as the US as far as obesity rates go. And I believe at the start of the project back in 2009, we were about a third of people were overweight, a third were obese. Obviously, that's now higher, and it's around sort of 40% of people are now obese. We have particular challenges because our childhood obesity rates are going up quite substantially. And when you get someone who is obese as a child and an adolescent, they're almost assured of being obese as an adult, and that's a really challenging situation for them. So we've got, again, I've said pretty poor obesity, and I think that the causes are, I mean, it's complicated, but I think that a lot of it is really diet related, and we have a diet which has very much changed. We're in an obesogenic environment where there's all these high calories. There's also GLP-1 receptors in the appetite centers of the brain, so it can then float around your blood, get into your brain, and trigger that directly. There's also GLP-1 receptors in the pancreas that helps with insulin secretion. And you have GLP-1 receptors in a variety of cells now, but also in neuronal cells and even cardiac cells.
Right. And also immune cells. I just came from a conference down in Southern California where they're talking about immunometabolism and how the GLP-1 cells can directly affect white blood cells and immune cells as well. Yeah, it's pretty incredible. So I think, this whole talk about GLP-1s is just an appetite suppressant. It's just too early. Like we're seeing effects of GLP-1s throughout our biology through this receptor mediated response in many, many cells. And maybe you can talk a little bit more about that. Where is the science going on GLP-1s as far as affecting Alzheimer's disease and cardiovascular health, et cetera?
Yeah, it's certainly going to be interesting where it goes. I mean, to my mind, what will be the most interesting is to see whether GLP-1 in its what I call endogenous state is able to have these protective effects. So right now what we're seeing studies where you look at a GLP-1 injectable and you'll see something like a reduction in C-reactive protein, right? So and they can be quite big reductions too, sort of up to 50% reduction, right? And that's obviously going to be protective for a lot of inflammatory related disease states as well as immunoaging. So what I'm hopeful to see is that going forward, people start looking at endogenous GLP-1 production. And so what I mean by that is stimulating your gut to produce more of your natural GLP-1 and then evaluating some of these linked effects. So not just appetite and glucose, but also looking at what's the C-reactive protein going like. If you're taking long term, can you have a change in cognitive performance in people? Can you change things like heart rate variation, which is an indication of changes in gut-brain signaling?
Sure.
And I think that's where I hope a lot of the research goes.
Yeah, it's an incredible new field that just kind of exploded just recently, and it's so interesting to kind of watch what's happening. As far as the other hormones, you mentioned tirzepatide. There's a new one coming out called retatrutide, which is actually 3 different hormones, right? Could you kind of maybe educate us a little bit more on this? What are the different injectable forms of this medication and how are they different from each other?
Yeah. So if you look at a semaglutide, so what the semaglutide is essentially a GLP-1 molecule. So you get your native GLP-1 in your body, and because its half-life is very low, 2 changes were made to stabilize it. And one of them is an amino acid change that stops it from being broken down by the enzyme in your body that typically breaks it down, and that's called DPP4. Right. And there's also a binding site to allow it to bind to the albumin better, so they add a binding molecule. And that changes the stability from being a half-life of about 2 minutes to around 1 week. Right, so that's the I guess the the GLP-1. Right. If you look at tirzepatide, tirzepatide has additional what they call GIP features as well. So it's a GLP-1 molecule with the next and what they call the C terminal is GIP.
So it's added
together. Okay. So it's got the functionality of 2 gut enzymes.
Right.
And
these are 2 separate gut enzymes naturally.
Gut hormones.
Hormones, right. These are 2 separate gut hormones naturally, but now you have one molecule combined that has both effects and is made more stable.
Yeah, absolutely. Both of them more. So GIP is also broken down by DPP4, and so they've done the same thing. They've stabilized that molecule so that it's not able to be broken down in the body as quickly. Right. So GLP-1 comes from enteroendocrine L cells, and GIP comes from enteroendocrine K cells. So they're both enteroendocrine gut hormones.
Correct.
And so what you tend to find when you go from one secreting or having one bioactivity, so one hormone gut hormone being active to 2, you tend to be able to get the same kind of effects or better effects with a reduction in side effect profile, right?
Interesting.
And so the reason for that is likely because if you think about the way these hormones work, is that at a low level they don't really do much. As you increase the level, they start to have additional effects, things like suppression of appetite, increasing in insulin release. And if you get to a very high level, they start to have gastrointestinal side effects, right? And so it's easier if you've got 2 hormones, it's easier to push them into the bioactive range without going in so much into the side effect range.
Makes sense.
Yeah. And so I think what we've found in studies previously, when they've used the endogenous version, the natural versions of hormones, having more than one means that you're more likely to get beneficial effects without side effects. And that's what we're seeing with these stabilized injectable molecules as well.
Got it.
So when you look at the weight loss, trizepatide has a better weight loss than semaglutides. But at an equivalent weight loss, it probably has a lower side effect profile.
Yes.
Yeah. And as we go forward, when they put on more enteroendocrine hormones, hopefully that will improve further.
Got it. And so what is retatrutide adding to this whole molecule?
I can't tell you off the top of my head which one it is. Yeah, I'd have to
Yeah,
look
I
that
can't
up.
remember. I can't remember either, but we'll put in the show notes for people to look at. But that's really interesting that they have a synergistic effect almost, where you have better weight loss with less side effects.
Yeah.
And I think that's an important point to kind of highlight, that as the science kind of rapidly evolves on this, the medications will be changing. And if someone has a side effect to one, then they could try a different one and potentially experience less side effects. Or if they're resistant to one, they can potentially try a different one and have a better weight loss journey, which, I do see some cases where people are completely resistant to semaglutide. They have absolutely no effect, and then they go on to tirzepatide and they can see some weight loss effects. Yeah. I kind of equated these injectable forms to the difference between someone taking like injectable testosterone versus versus taking like clomiphene, which gives you a natural push to make your own testosterone.
Yep.
And so obviously, taking injectable testosterone, you're kind of eliminating some of the natural secretion ups and downs that our body does, because you're just kind of giving it and it just stays at a certain level until it falls on its own.
Yep.
And so there's always, I think your body's an incredible machine that knows when it needs hormones and knows when to secrete, and is all tied into circadian rhythms and other rhythms of life. And so I get a little bit concerned about these 1 week long injections that you're always having this baseline level of GLP-1 that's way higher than your normal, right?
Yeah, you're preaching to the choir here. I agree with you completely. And I also use that testosterone analogy as well.
Yeah.
So that's the probably the biggest concern with the injectables is that they are so stable, right? And I guess the question can be asked, why did they make one that is stable for a week?
Yes.
Yeah. Because when they were when the development process was being done, and you can see this in the scientific papers, there are versions which have various amounts of stability, and there are even ones marketed that have various amounts of stability, and they might be shorter, and then you could allow your body to reset. For example, you might have an injectable, say if it was stable for 6 hours,
Right.
then you'd have activity during the day, but then during the evening when you're asleep at night, the activity would be gone, and that's a good chance for your body to reset. So to my mind, I'm guessing the likely reason was a marketing reason, and that if you're injecting something, injecting once a week is probably something people can tolerate. But if you're talking about injecting, twice a day, then that's something that maybe is more of a challenge. So yes, I agree with you, and I also think that it's the data on what happens to your natural GLP-1 when you take an injectable is conspicuously absent. Right, so you don't see it. So I haven't seen any data where they've said, look, if you inject GLP-1, your natural level stays the same, or is it completely suppressed?
Yeah.
If I had to guess, I'd guess it's completely suppressed, because that's what your body tends to do. It's what it would do with testosterone if you took injectable testosterone. And again, that's not necessarily a problem, because the body is, it is resilient, and it will start it up again when you stop the injectable. But just like when testosterone therapy, you will have a period of time when you're suppressed. And if you're going off a weight loss treatment, if you're using trizepatide or semaglutide for weight loss, you go off the treatment, suddenly you have no natural appetite suppression. It's going to be a really tough transition, and your weight will likely rebound. And again, that's what we're seeing, rebound weight afterwards.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, you know, once again, the body's a beautiful machine, and every hormone has a negative feedback mechanism. And when you eliminate that by doing an injectable, it can potentially cause problems, as you alluded to right there. Do you think that these injectable weight loss medications are going to have a moment where, and I'm hearing buzzes about this right now, where people are talking about doing a low dose constantly for longevity, for metabolic health controls, for avoidance of Alzheimer's, avoidance of cardiovascular disease. You know, you're hearing some buzz in this longevity community about doing a micro dose of this for a long period of time.
Yeah. I mean, there's definitely the possibility there, and I guess I'd answer that question with a question, and the question is that better than boosting up your natural GLP-1 production, right? And so, I mean, I would say that most people are probably GLP-1 suppressed now based on their diets and their lifestyle. And yes, you can take an injectable at a low dose to try boost your GLP-1 levels up. And all indications are currently that should be pretty beneficial for a lot of longevity-related conditions. I mean, we haven't done it before, so there's always the possibility that there's a long-term downside, but at the moment it's looking very promising. But if you could just get the same kind of GLP-1 effects just by modifying your diet. So when we did this work back in the early sort of 2010, around there, we took almost like a pharmaceutical approach to the project. And so we did what we call high throughput screening to really look to see how many compounds we could get to trigger GLP-1 release from these cells. So we grew what we call enteroendocrine cells in the lab, so human enteroendocrine cells, and we screened about 1,000 different plant extracts and compounds against them to see what would trigger GLP-1 to be released.
So you have these cells in a petri dish almost, and you're putting different plant compounds on the gut cells.
Yep.
Am I oversimplifying this?
It's pretty similar. Yeah, I mean,
okay. And then you're measuring GLP production by these cells?
Yep, GLP-1 release from the cells. Yeah.
So interesting. Okay, and so how, take me into your laboratory with you. Like, how long does that process take to test 1,000 different compounds on a gut cell that's grown in a petri dish?
It seems like an eternity. Yeah. It seems like quite a long time. Yeah. So the cells are actually really cool because if you look at them, they've got little secretory vesicles in them, so you can see the little areas where the GLP-1 is. And when you put the compounds on the cells, you can see the outside secretory vesicles actually release.
Wow.
Yeah. So it's quite a cool process.
And you can measure that?
And we can absolutely measure it. Yeah. It's not an easy measurement to do. So it's really an in-lab measure rather than something that you'd look at being able to do routinely as a blood work, say. Sure. But we definitely can measure it. It took a couple of years to do all of the screening, and it was in some ways really good and in some ways quite disappointing because what we found was that not really much triggered the cells to release a decent amount of GLP-1. So out of 1,000 different sort of compounds and extracts we tested, we ended up with 4 that got a decent GLP-1 release. So something we would think would be worthy of testing in people that we thought would give a high enough response to be effective.
But then how does food work, though? I mean, you assume that anytime you eat a good, nutritious meal, like a salad with some protein on it, that you get full after you eat this thing.
Yeah.
And that's mediated through GLP-1. However, you're saying you tested 1,000 different compounds and only 4 worked.
Yeah.
So is there like a mechanical component to this, or how do you?
I think it's a combination.
Yeah.
So one of the things that the pharmaceutical industry has been great about is telling people about how GLP-1 works and how great it is. But what they haven't done is they haven't said that in your body, GLP-1 is one of many hormones that tells you you're full. It's one of many hormones that affects your digestion. And so in your body, you have your meal, right? And if your meal is, say, a fatty meal, then your body will preferentially release a hormone called CCK, which is a very potent appetite suppressant. Again, not very stable. if you're having more of a carbohydrate meal, you might get more GLP-1 released, and then there's PYY as well. So it's a combination approach in your body.
Yeah.
Whereas we were really looking just for releasing GLP-1, and so we wanted something really potent.
Right, specifically potent. Got it. So what were those 4 compounds that you found?
Yeah, so that's another good story. And so one of them was it was a potato extract.
Okay.
Yeah. And so we thought that was really good. And so we looked at what the actual compounds present inside it were, and we found out that it was the compound that made it active was something called alpha-solanine. Now, that's a toxic glycol alkaloid that's released in potatoes when they're exposed to air.
Oh,
So if you've ever heard you shouldn't eat a green potato, that's because it produces alpha-solanine. So that was essentially no good because it worked, but it was too poisonous. Yeah. There were 2 other extracts. One was from a kiwi fruit skin, and the other one was from barley, a type of barley that's usually fed to horses. And the 2 of those were small peptide molecules. And the challenge with small peptides is they're not very stable in the gut. So when we tested them against gut acids, they just break down immediately.
Sure.
So it really left us just with one, which was a hop extract. And so that's what we ended up working on and doing clinical testing on.
And that was called Amarasate, is that right?
Yeah, so we named it Amarasate. And so this is what happens when you let scientists name things, right?
They sound very sciencey. Yeah, absolutely.
Well, so Amarasate comes from the Latin amarum, which means bitter, and satietis, which means satiety or fullness. So it means bitter fullness in Latin.
Oh my gosh, it makes total sense.
And because it was an academic project I was working on, there were no business people who could interfere with the naming of it until it was too late. Yeah.
I got it. It reminds me of Thomas Edison when he invented the light bulb. He tested hundreds and hundreds of different things to see how long they would burn, and also found one finally that worked.
Yeah.
And so I'm sure it was kind of a eureka moment for you in the lab when you found one that worked.
Yeah, it was amazing. To be fair, we didn't really believe it. We kept thinking, it's we must have done something wrong. I must have treated the cells, and so we had to do it a few times to be really sure. But yeah, it was amazing.
That's
absolutely
awesome.
Great.
So then, how do you go from this working in a petri dish to testing it in humans?
Yeah. So what we did was a few things. One, we isolated out all of the compounds present. So we test them to see what the bioactive compounds were. And so in this case, it was the hop alpha and beta acids, which are the sort of the bittering acids in hop. We then did some formulation work as well. Well, actually, to be fair, what we did then was we bought some and put it in a pill and tested it ourselves, which is not what you're meant to do.
Scientists again.
and to be fair, it didn't really work. And so we took it a few times, didn't really work. And then one day we realized that what was happening was that the extract, which is like a really thick wax, was basically passing through the body intact. And you could actually, if you went searching for it, you could find that waxy stuff in the toilet bowl.
Yeah.
And so we thought, well, we have to do some formulation, right? Because what we need it to disperse enough to interact with the surface of the gut, but not so much that it just gets such low concentration it won't trigger your gut cells. So we did a little bit of formulation work, and we found that if you add just a small amount of oil to it, you can facilitate that dispersion.
Okay.
So we then got the formulation all worked, and we tested that in some model digestion systems. So basically on-bench simulations of the human digestive tract.
Oh, okay.
Got that all ready, and then we decided it's time to do a sort of a clinical trial on people. And that was so the first clinical trial we did was basically 20 guys were recruited. They were given it's a cannula, so I think you call it an IV here.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
So we put it as that was to draw blood samples out of though. And we gave them the Amarasate extract an hour before eat till their full meal. Then they hadn't eat till they were full snack a couple of hours later. We measured how much food they were eating, and we measured a whole lot of hormones basically in their blood. And what we were able to show was that if you compared the Amarasate treatment to a placebo treatment, they ate 18% less food, which is a good amount of dietary food reduction. But they also had a six-fold in their GLP-1 level as a response to the meal. So the placebo was causing a threefold, and we were getting a six-fold. So that was a huge change.
Huge change,
right?
yeah.
And well into the area where you can get additional biological effects. So you can get that appetite suppression. We saw the same kind of effect in CCK, which is another appetite-suppressing hormone, again about sixfold. And in PYY, we saw about a twofold change, which PYY is a lot harder to change. It's further down the gut. It's,
Right.
it's more responsive to things like gut bacteria, but that was still a really good change there.
Yeah.
We also saw decreases in insulin levels, and that's likely due to delays in gastric emptying,
Right.
which GLP-1 and CCK both cause. And we saw a reduction in postprandial glucose levels immediately after the meal. So we had this full suite of like reduction of food intake, improvements in the glucose response, and all these appetite suppressing hormones going up.
So this is working not just on GLP-1, it's acting like food, and it's basically increasing GLP-1, CCK, like everything,
Yep.
just like a meal would do, basically.
Yeah. So the way we looked at it was like telling your body that a small meal was the same as a big meal as far as your appetite was concerned.
Right.
Yeah, and all your hormones were concerned as well. Yeah.
I see. That's very interesting. No side effects.
So we see a limited amount of side effects. So occasionally people get bloating and like a flushing effect, right? And that's particularly when they first start taking it, but it usually goes away in a couple of days.
Got it.
And again, I think the beauty about having a capsule as well is that it's very easy to tweak the dosage for people. You know, so if someone is a little bit more sensitive, you can just give them a little bit less.
Got it. And how do you determine what the right dose is?
Yeah, so in the studies we're running currently, so when
Yep.
we're looking at a longer term weight loss study at the moment, what we do is we just slowly dose people up. So we give them one capsule a day at 125 milligrams, and we see how they go for a week, and then we'll go to 2 capsules, and then 3, and then 4. And to be fair, most people end up on 4 capsules a day, but occasionally you'll get someone who's sensitive and they just take 1. And we also find, which is quite interesting, is that occasionally you'll have a person who takes 1 capsule and will say works for the whole day as well. So there's a little bit of variation, and that is the challenge with targeting the gut. So when you target the gut's more variable between people. You have to deal with different rates of gastric emptying, so there's more variation. The benefits of targeting the gut is that you don't have to get it absorbed into the blood to work, so there's better safety profiles, etc. So, there's a lot of pluses as well.
Yeah, and I always say everyone is an N of one, and so everyone's gut is completely different from somebody else's, and so it's you have to really individualize dosing when you're talking about things like this with the gut. Very different than pharmaceuticals, where there is a dose and you just kind of go with that dose.
Yeah.
And also, I think our guts are constantly changing depending on what we ate the last week or two. If we're traveling, our stress levels. So there might be changes in how our gut absorb this supplement as well.
Yeah,
right?
yeah. And one of the things we do notice is that when you're using the compound or the supplement to induce dietary change, quite often when people improve their diet, so they start off with a terrible diet, they're taking the supplement, it's taking the noise out of their brain, they're getting their dietary change done, then their gut is becoming naturally more sensitive anyway, and then suddenly they don't need as much of the supplement. Because their gut is resensitized because their diet's become better, and so we've seen that happen quite a lot as well.
Yeah. No, that's great work. And then when you're talking about this compound and fitting into people's lifestyle, is this something? There's a few different ways I could see this could be used. Number one, it could be used as an alternate to the injectable medication, but also maybe in conjunction with the injectable medications, because a lot of people are on the injectable, and maybe you might not want to be on this expensive injection forever, right?
Yeah.
And so, talk to me about different use cases for using this.
Yeah, absolutely. So when you talk about the GLP-1 injectables and how to use Amarasate in either collaboration or afterwards, there are a few ways physicians are using it.
Okay.
So the first way is just as a supplement. So instead of taking it. So typically when someone has maybe a slightly lower need to lose weight, and maybe they're afraid of needles, or not suitable for the injection for some other reason, quite often it can be used as just a simple alternative. Now, a lot of doctors are also now using it as a supplementary treatment for the injectable. So like, an adjunct therapy where someone is on the injectable, and quite frequently you can lower the dose of the injectable that's used and use the supplement over the top. But also it's being used when people suffer from, they take the injectable and they're fine for the first few days after the injectable, but then towards the end of that week, their hunger starts to come back, and it's just not lasting long enough. And so quite a few doctors are now supplementing at the end of that week just to keep the hunger from coming back.
Got it.
But probably the biggest use case, and to my mind, my favorite use case, is post-injectable.
Sure.
Right. And the reality is that not everyone either wants to be or can afford to be on a GLP-1 injectable for the rest of their life.
Right.
Now, if you can wean yourself off the injectable and wean yourself onto Amarasate, that's a really great way to work. And I think that the advantages we have there is that it's very likely that the Amarasate extract is kickstarting your body's natural gut signaling again.
Right.
Yeah, so it's telling your body to produce GLP-1, it's telling your body to release GLP-1, and you've just been telling, well, with the injectable, you've been telling your body, hey, don't make any GLP-1 at all for the last year.
Yes.
Now you've got something to really tell you to produce it, just like the Clomid you were talking about is telling your body to produce testosterone again. We're telling our body to produce GLP-1 again. So it's a really good transitional, I guess, treatment post GLP-1 injectables.
Yeah.
And I think the really great thing about it, using it post-treatment, is that you can take it for as long as you want, but there's also a lot of flexibility in that if you feel like you've made your dietary change, you've gone off your GLP-1 injectable and you're feeling stable at the moment, you can stop taking it.
Right.
Then if something happens in your life and you suddenly feel you need a bit of a boost, it's very easy to come on and off as you need, as just a booster, just to reinforce your dietary change.
Yeah, no, it's fantastic, and it's great that it came about around the same time as the injectables, because the conversation has already been started around GLP-1, and now we have this oral modality that works in a very different mechanism. And like you say, the GLP-1 injectable cuts off your natural secretion of GLP-1. You don't want that to happen. I mean, for the long term, you want your natural secretion to be supported. So it's great that these two things can really work together and complement each other as well. Yeah.
Yeah, and I can very much see a future where people are on low dose GLP-1s and taking a supplement like this as well,